I never imagined my weekend getaway would end like this. It was supposed to be a break from everything, a chance to clear my head and find some peace. When I found the cabin listed online, it seemed perfect. It was old and isolated, just what I needed. I thought the quiet would be good for me, and maybe I'd get some writing done. But things didn't go as planned. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The last part was down a dirt road that twisted through thick woods. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the place seem even more remote. The cabin was small, barely more than a shack, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. I remember thinking it looked like it had been forgotten by time, but that didn't bother me. In fact, it made me like the place even more. I wanted to be alone, away from people and noise. This place felt like the middle of nowhere. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a worn-out couch, and a bedroom in the back. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but I didn't mind. It felt like no one had been there in a long time, which was exactly what I was looking for. After unpacking, I sat down with a cup of coffee and just listened to the silence. It was nice, but there was something else too. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A strange feeling that settled in my chest, like the air was too thick, too heavy. I brushed it off as my imagination and told myself to relax. It wasn't until the next day that things started to feel off. I was exploring the cabin, opening drawers, and looking around just out of curiosity. In one of the bedrooms, I noticed a loose floorboard. I pried it up, expecting to find nothing more than dust and maybe a few old nails. But instead, I found something strange. Rusty chains coiled up like a snake, a saw with a blade, stained dark, and old photographs that made my skin crawl. The photos were of people, but their faces were wrong, twisted in pain or fear. I felt sick just looking at them. I quickly put everything back and tried to tell myself it was just old junk left by whoever owned the cabin before. But I couldn't shake the unease that was building inside me. Later that afternoon, I found the clippings. They were hidden in a drawer in the living room underneath a pile of yellowed papers. I almost didn't see them, but something made me dig deeper. The headlines screamed at me, stories about a serial killer who had terrorized the area years ago. The details were gruesome, describing how he tortured his victims before killing them. And then I saw it, a mention of this very cabin, where the killer had supposedly hidden out for weeks before he was finally caught. My blood ran cold as I realized the things I found earlier weren't just junk. They were part of his twisted collection. Panic hit me hard. I needed to leave, and I needed to leave now. I grabbed my bag and rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't turn, no matter how hard I pulled. I tried the windows next, but they were nailed shut, the boards across them blending in so well I hadn't noticed them before. Every exit was blocked, every door locked tight. I was trapped, just like the people in those photos. I started to lose it then. I banged on the walls, kicked at the doors, screamed for help, but no one could hear me. The cabin was too far from everything. I was alone, completely alone. And then, as I was searching for any possible way out, I triggered something. I don't know how, but suddenly a section of the floor gave way beneath me, sending me crashing down into a hidden room below. I landed hard, pain shooting through my leg as I tried to stand. The room was small, dark, and smelled of rot. And that's when I saw them. The traps. Razor-sharp wires strung across the room, waiting for someone to stumble into them. Heavy blades hanging from the ceiling, poised to drop at the slightest touch. The whole place was a death trap, designed to kill whoever dared to enter. I had to get out. Every second I stayed in that cabin was a second closer to death. My leg was bleeding, my hands shaking, but I couldn't stop moving. I tried to stay calm, to think, but it was like the cabin was alive, reacting to my every move. Each step I took seemed to set off another trap, another hidden mechanism designed to hurt, to kill. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder, heavier, until it was like I was suffocating. Desperation took over. I tried to think of how the killer had been caught, how anyone could have survived this nightmare. I searched for clues, for anything that might show me the way out. But the more I searched, the more I realized how carefully he had planned everything. There was no way out, no escape. Every path led to another trap, another dead end. In the end, I knew I had to take a chance. I found what looked like a weak spot in the wall, a place where the boards were loose. It was risky, but I had no other choice. I gathered all the strength I had left and rammed into it. The boards gave way, but not like I expected. Instead of an escape, I heard a click, a soft, almost gentle sound. And then I felt it, a cold metal blade pressing against my neck. I froze, not daring to move, barely breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for the blade to drop, waiting for the end. But it never came. Instead, there was only silence, the oppressive, crushing silence of the cabin that had become my prison. And then I realized something terrifying. I was still alive, but only because the cabin wanted me to be. It wasn't done with me yet. The story ends here because I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I'll make it out, or if I'm just another victim, another name added to the list. All I know is that the cabin is watching, waiting, and it's only a matter of time before it finishes what it started. I didn't think he would find me, not out here in this old cabin, so far from everything. The city, with its noise and chaos, feels like a different world now. I left it behind, driving as fast as I could, not stopping until the gas gauge hit empty. This place, hidden deep in the woods, seemed perfect, safe. I found it online, an old listing with grainy photos. The description said isolated and no modern amenities, which was exactly what I needed. I didn't care about the leaky roof or the fact that the nearest town was over an hour away. All I wanted was to be alone, away from him, away from the fear that had gripped me for weeks. I never thought he would track me here. When I first got to the cabin, it felt like a relief. It was smaller than I expected, with creaky wooden floors and a musty smell that clung to everything. But it was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but I didn't care. I checked the locks, closed the shutters, and tried to relax. I convinced myself that everything was fine, that I was finally safe. But then, I started to notice things. Little things. The front door lock seemed newer than the rest of the cabin, like someone had replaced it recently. The windows, too, didn't seem quite right. They were old, with paint peeling off, but they didn't budge when I tried to open them. I thought maybe they were just stuck, but the feeling of unease began to grow. I pushed it down, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was the third night when I heard it. A faint sound, like someone moving outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear more. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure it would give me away. But then, nothing. Just the wind in the trees, or maybe a branch scraping against the roof. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But the next morning, I found the first sign. A footprint, half covered by dirt, right outside the front door. I stared at it, my mind racing. It wasn't mine. It was too big, too deep in the earth. I hadn't heard anyone come close, but there it was. I felt sick. He had found me. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The lock turned, but the door wouldn't budge, like something was blocking it from the outside. Panic set in. I ran to the windows, but they were stuck fast, just like before. I tried to pry one open with a knife, but the blade snapped, leaving me with nothing but a useless handle. The walls seemed to close in around me, trapping me inside this place that had felt so safe just days ago. I searched the cabin for something, anything, I could use to get out, but every drawer was empty, every cupboard bare. It was like the cabin had been prepared for this, for trapping me here. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. I was alone, locked inside, and he was out there, waiting. I tried to calm down, to think clearly. Maybe there was another way out, something I had missed. I remembered the cellar door hidden beneath a rug in the corner of the cabin. I ran to it, my hands shaking as I pulled the rug aside and yanked on the door. It wouldn't open. The handle was rusty, and it wouldn't turn. I kicked at it in frustration, but it held firm, the wood creaking but not giving way. That's when I heard it again. The sound of someone outside, closer this time. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My pulse raced. He was here, right outside, and there was nothing I could do to stop him from coming in. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell, but he didn't come in. I started to wonder if he was toying with me, trying to drive me mad before making his move. The thought made me feel like I was losing my grip. I couldn't stay here, trapped like an animal. I had to do something. I decided to confront him, to face him, head on. Maybe it was the fear talking, or maybe I had just reached my breaking point. I grabbed the knife handle, the only thing I had left, and waited by the door. If he came in, I would be ready. The night dragged on, every sound amplified in the darkness. I thought I heard him breathing outside the door, a low, heavy sound that made my skin crawl. I gripped the knife handle tighter, my palms sweaty. But he never came in. I started to think that maybe he was waiting for me to come out, to make a mistake. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I hadn't slept, too afraid to close my eyes. The cabin, once my refuge, now felt like a prison. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to find a way out, or he would get to me. The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to keep moving. I checked the door again, but it was still stuck. The windows wouldn't open, and the cellar door was jammed. I was trapped, with no way out. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I slumped against the wall, feeling the weight of my situation. Then I heard it. A sound that sent a chill down my spine. The soft creak of the front door, slowly opening. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The door that had been stuck shut all night was now opening, and I knew he was finally coming for me. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I lost it, or maybe I just acted on instinct. But I ran, straight for the door, ready to face him. But when I got there, the door was wide open, and there was no one there. Just the empty woods, stretching out before me. I didn't stop to think. I ran out into the woods, not looking back, not caring where I was going. I just wanted to get away, to be free of that cabin and the terror it held. I kept running until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing in the dirt, gasping for breath. When I finally looked back, the cabin was gone, hidden by the trees. I never went back. I don't know if he's still out there, waiting, or if I imagined the whole thing. But I can still hear those footsteps in my mind, circling the cabin, getting closer and closer. And I know, deep down, that he's still out there, waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't want to go on the hunting trip, but my friend Jake insisted. He said it would be a great escape, something we needed. Work had been stressing me out, and he thought some time in the remote woods would clear my head. At first, it did. The first day was calm, almost too peaceful. We found a good spot near a stream to set up our camp, and as the sun set, we sat by the fire, laughing and talking about everything except the troubles back home. But that night, as I lay in the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was too thick, too heavy. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was overthinking it. Jake was snoring loudly, oblivious to my unease. So I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, hoping the next day would be better. The next morning, we set out early to track deer. The forest was dense, the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. We followed tracks for what seemed like miles until we stumbled upon something unexpected, a cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked old, weathered by time, but something about it seemed off. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, but the air around it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. "Let's check it out," Jake whispered, more out of curiosity than any real interest. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem scared, so I followed him. As we got closer, we noticed the cabin wasn't abandoned. The door was slightly ajar, and inside we found fresh supplies, canned food, water jugs, even some tools laid out on a table. It was clear someone had been there recently, but there was no sign of anyone now. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't a hunting cabin, it was a hideout, and we had just walked right into it. "We should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but Jake was already moving deeper into the cabin, examining everything like we were on some kind of adventure. I stayed near the door, my eyes darting to the woods outside, my ears straining to hear anything unusual. And then I heard it. Voices getting closer. "Someone's coming," I hissed at Jake, who froze in place. We scrambled to hide, squeezing ourselves into a small closet at the back of the cabin. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they would hear it. The voices grew louder, and soon a group of men entered the cabin. I could see them through the crack in the door. They were armed, carrying rifles and shotguns, and they looked angry. "You sure no one followed you?" one of them asked, his voice rough. "Positive. This place is too far out," another replied, tossing a bag onto the table. "No one's stupid enough to come here." They started talking about their plans, about how they had taken down a group of deer the day before and how much money they were going to make. My stomach turned as I realized these weren't just hunters. They were poachers, and we were trapped in their hideout. Jake looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. We had to get out, but how? The men were right there, and the door was the only way out. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, my breath coming in shallow gasps. We were going to die here, and it was all my fault for not insisting we leave when we first saw the cabin. Then, one of them said something that made my blood run cold. "We need to move the stuff tonight. Can't risk anyone finding out what we're doing." That was it. If they found us, they wouldn't let us go. We had to make a run for it. I motioned to Jake, and we slowly, carefully opened the closet door. The men were busy packing up their supplies, not paying attention to us. We made it to the door, but as we stepped outside, Jake tripped over a loose board, making a loud noise. "What was that?" one of the men shouted. We bolted, running as fast as we could into the woods. Behind us, I heard the men shouting, then the deafening sound of gunshots. I didn't look back. I just kept running, branches slashing at my face, the ground uneven under my feet. Jake was right behind me, but I could hear him struggling to keep up. "Go left," I shouted, hoping to lose them in the dense forest. We veered off the path, but the poachers were right behind us. The gunshots were getting closer, and I knew we couldn't outrun them forever. "Split up," I yelled. It was the only chance we had. Jake hesitated but then nodded, and we went in different directions. I ran until my lungs burned, until I couldn't hear the men anymore. I found a cave and hid inside, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm my racing heart. But then I heard voices again, closer this time. They had caught Jake. I could hear him begging, pleading for his life. And then there was silence, followed by a single gunshot. I bit down on my hand to stop myself from screaming. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I crawled out of the cave. The sun was rising, but it didn't bring any warmth or comfort. I was alone, and Jake was dead. I found the poacher's vehicle, but it was locked. I didn't have the strength to break in, so I decided to head back to our camp. But when I got there, the camp was destroyed. Our gear was scattered, the tents ripped apart. They had found it, just like they found Jake. I was standing there, trying to figure out what to do, when I felt it. A presence behind me, a shadow that loomed over me. I turned around slowly, my heart in my throat. The last thing I saw was a flash of movement, then nothing. I don't know how I'm writing this, or if anyone will believe me, but if you're reading this, stay out of those woods. Don't make the same mistake we did. I took a road trip to clear my head. Work had been overwhelming and I needed some time alone. I thought driving through the countryside would help. I found a route online that promised beautiful views and quiet roads. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first few hours were peaceful, trees on both sides of the road, their leaves just starting to turn the colors of fall. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink. But then, without warning, my car started to slow down. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but the engine sputtered and died. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road. There was no signal on my phone. Panic started to creep in. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, and the sun was almost gone. I got out of the car, hoping to find something that could help, but there was nothing around me but trees and darkness. I tried restarting the car several times, but it was no use. I even checked under the hood, not that I knew what I was looking for, but it made me feel like I was doing something. Finally, I gave up and leaned against the car, feeling the cold night air settle in. That's when I noticed a faint light through the trees, far off the road. A cabin, maybe? It was my only hope, so I started walking toward it, hoping someone there could help me. The cabin was old, the wood dark and weathered. I hesitated before knocking, but I didn't have a choice. A few moments later, an older man opened the door. He looked surprised to see me, but quickly smiled. He asked if I needed help, and I explained my situation. He nodded and said he could take a look at my car. He seemed kind, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. I couldn't place it, but I didn't have any other options. We walked back to my car in silence. He asked me to pop the hood again and started tinkering with the engine. I stood by, feeling useless. After a while, he said it would take some time and suggested I wait in his cabin. I wasn't comfortable leaving him alone with my car, but it was getting colder, and he was the only help I had, so I agreed. Inside the cabin, it was warm but strangely empty. There was a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace that wasn't lit. I noticed some old photos on the wall, all black and white, showing people I didn't recognize. They all had the same expression: fear. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I tried to distract myself, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. As I sat at the table, I noticed a door at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, and curiosity got the better of me. I walked over and pushed it open. The room inside was too clean, almost sterile. It felt out of place in such an old, dusty cabin. There were no personal items, just a bed with perfectly folded sheets and a small dresser. I turned back, ready to leave, when I saw another door hidden behind the dresser. My heart started to race. I knew I shouldn't, but I pulled the dresser away and opened the door. It led down to a small basement, dark and cold. I hesitated but stepped inside. The basement was soundproofed, with walls covered in thick padding. There was a table in the middle, and on it were more photos. These were recent, and to my horror, they showed people in various stages of fear and pain. I realized then that the man wasn't just some helpful stranger. He was something much worse. I had to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps upstairs. He was coming back. I couldn't let him find me here. I quickly and quietly moved the dresser back in place, closed the door, and ran out of the cabin as fast as I could. I didn't care about my car anymore. I just needed to get away. The woods were dark, and I could hear him calling out, asking where I was. His voice was calm, but there was a menace behind it. I kept running, my heart pounding in my chest. I tripped over roots and branches, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the road again. I stumbled out of the trees, waving my arms at the first car that drove by. The driver stopped, a middle-aged woman who looked at me with concern. I quickly told her what happened, and she didn't hesitate to let me in. As we drove away, I looked back at the dark woods, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. When I got to the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They listened to my story, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Still, they agreed to go back with me to the cabin. But when we arrived, the cabin was empty. The man was gone, and so was any sign of what I'd found. My car was still there, but it started up without a problem this time. The police gave me a skeptical look, but they couldn't do much without evidence. I left town that night, driving straight home, not stopping until I reached my apartment. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. Every time I hear a creak in my floorboards or see a shadow move in the corner of my eye, I wonder if he's found me again. I don't think I'll ever take another road trip alone. When I inherited the cabin, it felt like life was finally turning around. I had been struggling, trying to make ends meet, but nothing seemed to work. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from a lawyer saying that a distant relative, someone I didn't even know existed, had left me an old cabin in the mountains. The idea of a place to call my own, far from the noise and stress, was like a dream. I packed up my things and drove out to see it, thinking this could be a fresh start, maybe even a place to settle down. The drive up was long and winding, and the roads got narrower as I climbed higher into the mountains. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the thick woods surrounding the property. The cabin itself looked old, like it had been standing there for decades, untouched by time. The wood was weathered, and the windows were covered in a thin layer of dust. It was exactly what I imagined, a quiet, peaceful place to escape from everything. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, stale like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The first thing I noticed was the dust, thick layers of it covering everything. The furniture was old and mismatched, like it had been scavenged from different places. But it wasn't just that. There were locked doors, ones I didn't have the keys to, and strange stains on the floorboards, dark and almost sticky to the touch. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my nerves. The place was old after all, and I was probably letting my imagination run wild. I spent the next few days cleaning and trying to make the cabin feel like home. But as I started to explore more, I found things that didn't make sense. In the attic, Buried under old blankets and broken furniture, I found a box filled with documents, photos, and even some old newspaper clippings. At first, I didn't think much of it, just old stuff left behind. But as I started going through it, a story started to form, one that made my skin crawl. The cabin, it turned out, wasn't just some quiet retreat in the woods. It had a history, a dark one. The papers talked about illegal activities, drug deals, trafficking, things that seemed too horrible to be true. There were photos of people I didn't recognize, and the articles talked about arrests and disappearances connected to this very place. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what I was reading. This cabin wasn't just some family heirloom, it was a hideout, a place where terrible things had happened. I should have left right then, packed up my things, and gone back to the city, but I didn't. I told myself it was just the past, that whatever happened here was long over. Curiosity kept me there, a need to understand why this place had been passed down to me. I started to wonder about the relative who left it to me. Who were they? And why hadn't I known about them before? The questions swirled in my mind, but I didn't have any answers. It was a few nights later when things started to get really strange. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. My heart raced as I listened, straining to hear more. But the footsteps stopped, and I convinced myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, passing through. But the next morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. And then there were other things, small, almost unnoticeable at first. A chair moved. The papers I had been reading scattered on the floor. A window left open. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was there, hiding just out of sight. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The people who had used this cabin before, they weren't gone. They were back, and they wanted something. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew it was real. The final straw came one night when I heard voices, low and menacing, outside the window. They were talking about the cabin, about me. I froze, barely breathing as I listened. "He knows too much," one of them said. "We can't let him leave." Panic surged through me. I was trapped. I couldn't just walk out and drive away. They would catch me. I had to face them, talk my way out of it. I stepped outside, my heart in my throat, and came face to face with them. 3 men, rough and dangerous looking. They didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with cold, hard eyes. I tried to explain, to tell them I didn't know anything, that I just inherited the cabin and had no idea about its past. But they didn't believe me. One of them stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "You think we're stupid?" he said. "You think you can just walk away?" I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. This was it. I was done for. But then, something changed. One of the men looked at me, really looked, and his expression shifted. It was like he recognized something in me, something I didn't even know was there. "Wait," he said, holding up a hand to stop the others. "He's not just some random guy." The others hesitated, confused. The man who spoke stared at me, his eyes narrowing. "You're connected to this place, aren't you? You were meant to be here." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what he was talking about. But before I could figure it out, they turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking with fear and confusion. The next morning, they were gone. I packed up my things and left, not daring to look back. But as I drove away, one thought kept running through my mind. What did they mean? Why was I chosen to inherit this place? And as much as I wanted to forget, I knew I never would. I didn't want to go. I told them the stories about the cabin were more than rumors. But my friends laughed it off, said it would be fun. I didn't want to be the one who ruined the day, so I went along. We should have never gone. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the usual hiking trails. We walked for hours, the trees growing thicker, the light fading even though it was only midday. When we finally saw it, the place looked almost normal, like it was just another old cabin. But there was something off. I felt it before we even stepped inside. The door creaked when we opened it, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and something else, something I couldn't place. The first room was small, just a dusty living area with broken furniture. It looked like no one had been here for years. But then I saw the survival gear. It was all outdated but organized, almost like someone was still using it, preparing for something. "This place is creepy," one of my friends said, but we all pretended it was no big deal. We moved further in, through a narrow hallway. That's when things got strange. The doors were reinforced with metal plates, heavy and solid, like someone wanted to keep something out, or in. We found a hidden compartment under a loose floorboard. Inside was a journal, old and worn, filled with cramped writing. I didn't want to touch it, but one of my friends picked it up, flipping through the pages. His face went pale as he read out loud. The survivalist who lived here believed only the strong deserved to live. The cabin was his test, a place to prove who was worthy. He wrote about the traps he set, how they were meant to challenge and kill. And he wasn't just talking about animals. That's when the first trap triggered. It was so fast. A wire, almost invisible, stretched across the hallway. My friend tripped it, and a heavy metal spike shot out from the wall, missing him by inches. We all froze, staring at the spike lodged in the opposite wall. If he had been just a little closer, panic set in. We needed to leave, but when we turned back to the front door, it wouldn't open. Someone had sealed it from the outside. That's when we knew. Someone was still here. Someone who wanted us to stay. The next hours were a blur of fear and desperation. We tried to find another way out, but every path was blocked or booby-trapped. A friend tried the window, but the moment he touched the frame, a hidden blade sliced through his hand. Blood everywhere, his screams echoing through the cabin. I wrapped his hand with a piece of cloth, but it wouldn't stop bleeding. He was losing strength, and so were we. The survivalist's journal made it clear. This was a game to him, a sick test of who could survive his traps. And he was watching us, waiting to see if we were strong enough. But I didn't feel strong. None of us did. We argued, voices shaking with fear. Some wanted to stay put, hoping for rescue, but I knew no one would come. We were too far from anyone who could help. Others wanted to risk running through the woods, but I reminded them about the traps. We couldn't trust anything here. We found more traps, each more brutal than the last. One friend fell into a pit lined with spikes. We tried to pull him out, but he was too heavy, and the spikes had already done their work. The light in his eyes faded as we watched, helpless. Another friend was taken by a tripwire, triggering a flurry of darts from the walls. I tried to help, but there was nothing I could do. The darts were poisoned. I could see it in how quickly he collapsed. In the end, it was just me and one other, the one with the cut hand. He was weak, barely able to stand, and I knew he wouldn't make it much longer. We found the last trap together, a door that led to what looked like a way out, but I knew it was a lie. The journal had talked about a final test, one that would push us to our limits. I had a choice, leave him behind and maybe survive, or try to take him with me and risk both our lives. He looked at me, eyes pleading, but he didn't say a word. He knew, just like I did, what was about to happen. I left him. I ran through the door, the sounds of his screams following me. The last trap triggered as I crossed the threshold, but I was already through. I heard the crash behind me, the sound of metal meeting flesh, and I didn't look back. I kept running until I was out of the woods, out of the nightmare that cabin had become. I survived, but I'm not sure I was the stronger one. The survivalist test wasn't just about physical traps. It was about breaking us, making us betray each other, lose our humanity. I made it out, but I'm not the same. Every night I see their faces, hear their screams. I wonder if the survivalist was right. Maybe survival isn't about strength, but about how much of yourself you're willing to lose. The cabin is still out there, waiting for the next group of fools to stumble in, thinking it's just another abandoned place. It's not. It's a test, and if you go in, you might come out alive, but you won't come out whole. I needed a break from everything, the noise, the crowds, the constant pressure. So, when I found that cabin online, it felt like a sign. A small, remote place in the woods, far from the city. No cell service, no internet, just what I needed. I booked it without thinking twice. The first day, there was perfect. I spent it doing nothing but relaxing. I sat on the porch, listened to the birds, and watched the trees sway in the wind. It felt like a different world, one where I could breathe and be alone with my thoughts. The air was fresh, and the silence was so deep it almost hurt my ears. But as the day went on, that silence started to feel different. Heavier, maybe. There was a kind of tension in it, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just being silly, that I wasn't used to being so far from everything. To clear my mind, I decided to go for a walk before it got dark. There was a path behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. It seemed inviting at first, a little adventure to end the day. I didn't realize then that it would be a decision I'd regret. I walked for a while, the path twisting through the trees. The further I went, the more the woods closed in around me. The trees grew thicker, the shadows longer. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone when I heard it. Voices. Men talking, their words too low for me to understand. I slowed down, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then I saw them. There were 3 of them, standing in a clearing just ahead. I froze, half hidden behind a tree, not sure what to do. They hadn't seen me yet, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I told myself to stay calm, that they were probably just hunters or hikers. But then, one of them moved, and I saw what they were standing over. A body, lifeless, limp, face down in the dirt. Blood pooled around it, dark and thick. One of the men was holding a shovel, the other 2 had guns. My heart stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. My body felt disconnected, like I was watching from somewhere else. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. And then, one of them looked up. His eyes locked onto mine. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he shouted, pointing towards me, and I ran. I didn't think. I just ran as fast as I could, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes. I could hear them behind me, chasing, yelling. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out, but I couldn't stop. I had to get back to the cabin, to safety. But when I finally burst out of the woods and saw the cabin, my heart sank. It wasn't safety. It was a trap. They knew where I was now. They were coming for me. I slammed the door behind me, bolting it shut. My hands shook as I looked around for something, anything I could use to defend myself. The cabin was small, just one room with a bed, a table, a few chairs. A knife in the kitchen drawer was all I found. It didn't feel like enough. I heard them outside, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. They weren't yelling anymore. They were quiet now. That scared me more. They started banging on the door, trying to force it open. I pushed the table against it, then the chairs, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out the words. They sounded calm, like this was just another day for them. Like killing me would be no different than what they'd done to that poor soul in the woods. I was shaking so hard I thought I might drop the knife. The door creaked, the wood splintering under the pressure. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Desperation clawed at me. I was trapped, nowhere to run. If they got in, I was dead. I had to do something. The window was too small to crawl through, but I could break it, use the shards as more weapons. I grabbed a chair and smashed it against the glass. The noise was loud, too loud, but it didn't matter now. I needed every advantage I could get. The door gave way and they were inside. 3 of them, just like I'd seen in the clearing. I swung the knife wildly, panic taking over. I didn't know if I could fight them, but I had to try. One of them lunged at me and I slashed at him, the blade catching his arm. He yelled, more in anger than pain. I backed away, trying to keep them all in front of me. But the cabin was too small. They were too close. One grabbed me from behind, his arm around my throat, squeezing. I thrashed, kicking, trying to break free, but he was too strong. My vision blurred, black spots dancing in front of my eyes. I felt another one grab my arm, trying to wrestle the knife away. I twisted, the blade slicing through flesh, hot blood spraying across my face. I heard a scream, then a gunshot, deafening in the small space. The grip on my throat loosened, and I dropped to the floor, gasping for air. They were still coming. I couldn't see straight, but I knew I couldn't stop. I crawled towards the broken window, grabbing a shard of glass. One of them loomed over me, his face twisted with rage. I slashed up, catching him across the face. He stumbled back, howling in pain. I scrambled to my feet, my legs barely holding me up. I didn't think. I just ran again, out of the cabin, into the night. The woods were darker now, the trees pressing in on all sides. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep moving. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body screaming in pain, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't know if they were still behind me, but I couldn't take the chance. I had to get away, had to find help. When I finally stopped, I was far from the cabin, deep in the woods. The night was silent again, the only sound my own harsh breathing. I collapsed against a tree, my body shaking. I was alive. Somehow I had survived, but the fear didn't leave me. I didn't know if they were dead or if they were still out there, hunting me. The darkness seemed to close in, the silence too heavy. I was alone, hurt and terrified, unsure if I would ever be safe again. It was a rainy night, the kind of rain that makes you feel like the world is closing in. I was driving alone, lost in thoughts, trying to keep my eyes on the road. The storm was getting worse, and the road was deserted. I should have stopped, waited it out, but I was too stubborn. I just wanted to get home. That's when it happened. My car slid, tires losing grip on the wet pavement. I tried to control it, but it was too late. The car spun, and I remember the crash, the impact, the sharp pain, and then darkness. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the smell of the forest, like you would expect from a cabin, but something damp, something rotten. My head was pounding, and I felt dizzy. I tried to sit up, but something was wrong. My wrist felt heavy, I looked down and saw it. The chain, cold and unyielding, wrapped tightly around my wrist, attaching me to the bed. Panic surged through me. I yanked at the chain, but it didn't budge. The room was spinning, and I had no strength. The room was small, with wooden walls and a single window. The light was dim, coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was nothing familiar about this place. I had no idea where I was or how I got there. All I knew was that I was trapped, and I needed to get out. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as the door creaked open. A man walked in. He was tall, with a calm, almost casual demeanor, as if he had just walked into his own home after a long day. He had dark hair, neatly combed, and his clothes were clean, almost too clean for a place like this. But what struck me the most was the look in his eyes. They were cold, calculating, with a hint of something else, something that made my skin crawl. He looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said he was in control, that he knew exactly what he was doing. "You're awake," he said, his voice calm. "Good. We can begin." "Begin what?" I wanted to ask, but my mouth was dry and no words came out. I just stared at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. He walked over to the bed, his eyes never leaving mine. "You were in a bad accident," he said, as if that explained everything. "But don't worry, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to fix you." Fix me? The words didn't make sense. I wasn't broken. I was hurt, but I wasn't broken. Then it hit me. This man wasn't here to help me. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't anything but a monster. My body tensed as he reached out, his hand brushing against my face, his touch cold and mechanical. I jerked away, pulling at the chain, but he didn't seem bothered. He just watched, his smile never fading. "I know you're scared," he said, as if he was talking to a child. "But you don't need to be. It'll be over soon." Over soon. My mind was racing, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. I was chained, weak, and completely at his mercy. I tried to reason with him, tried to plead, but he wasn't listening. He was lost in his own world, a world where pain was something to be enjoyed, something to be inflicted. The hours that followed were a blur of agony and despair. He didn't just hurt me, he enjoyed it. Every time I screamed, he seemed to get more excited, his calm demeanor cracking just enough to show the madness beneath. I tried everything to escape, reasoning, begging, even pretending to go along with his twisted games. But nothing worked. He was always one step ahead, always in control. Then, one day, during one of his sessions, I noticed it. A small key hanging from his belt. It was almost invisible, hidden among the tools he used to torture me. But it was there. My heart raced as I realized what it meant. If I could just get that key, I could free myself. But how? He was always watching, always ready to stop me. I endured the pain, biting back my screams, waiting for the right moment. It came when he was distracted, too caught up in his own twisted pleasure to notice me slipping my hand toward his belt. I grabbed the key, my fingers trembling, and hid it under the mattress, praying he wouldn't notice. That night, when he left me alone, I worked the key into the lock, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The lock clicked open, and the chain fell away. I was free. Or so I thought. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak and unsteady, and made my way to the door. It was open, just a crack, as if inviting me to leave. But when I pushed it open, what I saw made my blood run cold. The cabin wasn't just a cabin. It was a prison, a place where others had been brought, just like me. They were there, chained to walls, broken and lifeless, their eyes hollow. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the horror of what I was seeing. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his smile wider than ever. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. I tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed me, dragging me back to the bed, chaining me up again, tighter this time. The hope I had felt, that brief moment of freedom, was gone, replaced by a crushing despair. I knew then that there was no escape, that this was my life now, an endless cycle of pain and suffering, with no way out. The last thing I remember is his smile, that cold, cruel smile, as he closed the door, leaving me alone in the darkness, waiting for the next time, for the next session. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I know one thing. No one is coming to save me. No one ever will. It was supposed to be a fun day out. We were just a bunch of friends, looking for some excitement before summer ended. The idea of playing hide and seek in the forest came up, and it sounded like a perfect way to relive childhood memories. The forest was dense, the kind that felt endless, with towering trees and thick underbrush. We all agreed to meet back at the large oak tree in the center after 30 minutes. It seemed safe enough, a way to add a bit of thrill to an otherwise lazy afternoon. We set off in different directions, laughing and joking about who would win. I headed deeper into the woods, finding a good spot to hide. I could hear the faint sounds of my friends in the distance, their voices blending with the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The air was cool, the kind that gives you a little chill, but nothing too uncomfortable. As time passed, the forest grew quieter. The laughter and footsteps faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I thought it was odd, but I brushed it off, thinking the game was just getting more serious. Then, the 30 minutes were up. I made my way back to the oak tree, expecting to see everyone there, but only 2 of them had shown up. Sam was missing. We laughed it off at first, thinking he was just trying to scare us. But as the minutes ticked by, our laughter died down. We called out his name, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. The silence that followed was heavier, more oppressive. Something felt wrong. We decided to split up and search for him, thinking he might have gotten lost or found a really good hiding spot. I paired up with Lily, and we headed in the direction Sam had gone. The forest felt different now, darker even though the sun was still up. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows longer. Every crack of a twig made me jump, but I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was just the tension of the game. Then Lily disappeared. It happened so quickly. One moment she was beside me, and the next she was gone. I called out to her, my voice trembling, but there was no reply, just that crushing silence again. Panic started to creep in. I ran back to the oak tree, hoping the others had found Sam and were just waiting for us there, but no one was around. I was alone, and it hit me that something terrible was happening. Desperation drove me to keep searching. I called out their names, hoping to hear anything, even a laugh, a sign that it was all a joke. But the forest was dead silent, except for the sound of my own breathing, which was getting louder, more frantic. As I pushed through the underbrush, I stumbled upon something that made my heart drop. An old abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see footprints in the dirt leading inside. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but I had no choice. I had to find my friends. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and something else. something metallic that I couldn't quite place. The walls were lined with old broken furniture, and the windows were covered in grime, barely letting any light in. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A piece of clothing, blood-stained and crumpled on the floor. It was Sam's shirt. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a joke. This was real, and we were in serious danger. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, but it was stuck, like someone had locked it from the outside. Panic surged through me, and I ran to the windows. But they were sealed shut, covered with thick wooden boards. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching from outside, slow and deliberate. They were getting closer, the sound of boots crunching on the gravel, and my heart pounded in my chest. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I wasn't alone. Someone else was out there. Someone who had taken my friends, and now they were coming for me. It was then that Matt, another friend, broke the silence. He was hidden behind an old rotting sofa, pale and trembling. He whispered that he had seen someone earlier, someone lurking in the woods before we started the game. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it all made sense. We were being hunted. With no way out, we had to act fast. We grabbed anything we could find, using it to break down the walls of the cabin. The wood was old and brittle, and it started to give way under our frantic efforts. But the footsteps were getting closer, almost at the door now. Each thud echoed in the small space, a reminder of how little time we had. We managed to break through a section of the wall, enough to squeeze through, but just as we were about to escape, the footsteps stopped, right outside the door. The sound was so close, I could almost feel the presence on the other side, listening, waiting. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't come inside. Then, the door creaked open. I don't know what happened after that. My mind blanks out, but I remember the fear, the overwhelming sense of doom. We weren't supposed to be there, and now we were trapped. The last thing I remember is the sound of the door opening and then nothing. I wish I could say we all made it out, that it was just a horrible misunderstanding, but I can't. I don't know what happened to the others, or even if I'm really safe now. All I know is that the forest still stands, and the cabin is still there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting friends to wander in. If you ever find yourself in those woods, and you see that cabin, run. Don't look back, and don't go inside. Some doors are better left closed. I decided to rent a cabin for the weekend. I needed to get away from everything, work, noise, people. I found this place online, tucked away deep in the woods, no neighbors for miles. The photos looked nice enough. Cozy little place, all wood and warmth, surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect, or so I thought. When I got there, it was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but that's what I wanted. No sounds of cars or city life, just the wind moving through the leaves. The cabin was exactly like the pictures, small, rustic, with a slight creak in the floorboards when you walked. I unpacked my things, feeling the stress of the city life start to melt away. But something felt off. I can't explain it, but there was this feeling in the air, like the cabin was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation, that it would take time to adjust to the silence. The first night was fine, mostly. I read a book, made some tea, and went to bed early. I remember waking up a few times, though, because it was too dark. The kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. No street lights, no glowing screens, just pitch black. The next day, I decided to explore the cabin a bit. That's when I found it, the trap door. It was hidden under an old rug in the living room, just a small square of wood in the floor. It wasn't mentioned in the listing, which struck me as strange. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it. I had this weird feeling, like opening it would be a bad idea, but curiosity got the better of me. The door was heavier than it looked. When I finally managed to pull it open, the smell hit me first. Damp, musty air, like the basement hadn't been touched in years. There were stairs leading down, creaky and covered in dust. I hesitated, but eventually grabbed a flashlight and went down. The basement was small, just one room, really. The walls were lined with shelves, and there were old boxes stacked everywhere. I started looking through them, not really expecting to find anything interesting. Most were filled with junk, old clothes, books, random stuff like that. Then I found the photos. They were in an old wooden box, the kind that looked like it should be full of someone's keepsakes. Inside were dozens of photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. The first few were innocent enough, just people smiling in front of the cabin, posing by the fireplace, out in the woods. But as I kept flipping through them, the mood changed. The smiles became forced. The people's eyes filled with fear. The last photo of each person was the worst. They were all taken in the same place, in the basement, just like where I was standing. The people looked terrified, like they knew something terrible was about to happen. And then I found a photo of myself. It was on top of the others, just sitting there like it had been waiting for me. It showed me arriving at the cabin just yesterday. But the weird thing is, I didn't see anyone taking a picture of me. I looked closer and noticed the angle. It was taken from inside the cabin, through the window. Panic set in fast. I dropped the photo and ran upstairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. I grabbed my things, not even bothering to pack properly, and headed for the door. But when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door stayed shut, like it was locked from the outside. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I tried again, moving around the cabin, holding my phone up, desperate for a single bar, but there was nothing. The fear started to choke me. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. I ran to the car, hoping to just drive out of there, but the car wouldn't start. The engine didn't even make a sound. I looked back at the cabin, and that's when I saw it. Another photo, taped to the inside of the car's windshield. It was a photo of me, taken from inside the car just minutes ago. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Someone was in the cabin with me, someone who had been watching me from the moment I arrived. I could feel them nearby, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make their move. I ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't help. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about the other photos, the terrified faces of the people who had stayed here before me. I was next. I was sure of it. I don't know how long I stayed in the cabin, maybe hours, maybe days. Time started to blur, my thoughts becoming more frantic. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a figure. I kept checking the photos, hoping to find some clue. But they all told the same story. People came here, they got scared, and then they disappeared. In the end, I didn't have a choice. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew that I might not make it out. I waited until nightfall, hoping that whoever was watching me would slip up, give me a chance to escape. I grabbed the keys and slowly opened the door, praying it would finally open. It did. I ran to the car, throwing everything inside, not caring if I left anything behind. The car started this time, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I don't know if anyone will believe me. Maybe I wouldn't believe it myself if it hadn't happened. But I'm telling this story because someone needs to know. The cabin is still out there, waiting for the next person to stumble across that trap door. And when they do, they might not be as lucky as I was. We found the map while sorting through old boxes in my grandmother's attic. It was dusty, folded several times, and hidden inside an old book. My partner, Lisa, and I were intrigued. It was hand-drawn, with a winding trail leading to a small mark deep in the woods. The idea of finding something forgotten, maybe a family treasure or an old cabin, excited us. We had been stuck in a routine for too long, and this felt like the adventure we needed. "Let's go," Lisa said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I nodded, thinking about how different and thrilling this would be from our normal life. We packed quickly, grabbing essentials: water, food, a flashlight, and a knife, just in case. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. It was meant to be our little secret. The hike was harder than we thought. The trail on the map was barely visible in reality, overgrown with bushes and fallen trees. We walked for hours, the sun dipping lower, the woods becoming darker, but we pushed on, driven by the mystery of what we might find. When we finally reached the cabin, it was almost dusk. The place was secluded, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the remaining light. It looked old, like it hadn't been used in years, but something was off. Fresh tire tracks led to the cabin, and there was a half-burned campfire outside. Someone had been here recently. "Weird," Lisa muttered, her excitement fading a bit, but we were tired, and the idea of resting inside the cabin was tempting. We pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The air was musty, and the wooden floorboards creaked under our feet. The cabin was small, just one main room with an old fireplace, a table, and a few chairs. There was another door at the back, likely leading to a bedroom or a storage room. As we explored, unease settled in. The walls had strange marks, deep scratches that looked like something or someone had clawed at them. In the corner, a hidden room, more like a large closet, was filled with hunting gear, rifles, knives, and traps. It didn't make sense for a simple cabin in the woods. "Do you think it's still used?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling slightly. I shrugged, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. We decided to stay, convincing ourselves that we were just overthinking things. After all, what were the chances that whoever had been here would come back? Then I found the notebook. It was lying under the table, half hidden in the shadows. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. My heart sank as I read. It wasn't just a journal. It was a log of every person who had come to the cabin. There were detailed observations, dates, and even photos. Photos of people who had been here, some recent, some old. Each entry ended with a note. "Taken." I showed Lisa, and we both stared at the pages, our fear growing with each passing second. We weren't the first to come here, following that map. We had walked right into a trap, and someone had been watching us since we arrived. "We need to leave," I whispered, the words barely escaping my dry throat. Lisa nodded, her face pale. We grabbed our things and headed for the door, but just as we reached it, we heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching the dead leaves underfoot. "Back door," Lisa hissed, pulling me towards the other room. But the door was locked, and there was no key in sight. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were right outside now. We could hear them breathing. We were trapped. There was no way out except through the front door, where the person waited. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. Lisa was shaking, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to fight," I said, my voice shaking. We didn't have a choice. The hunting gear in the closet seemed like our only hope. We quickly grabbed a rifle and a knife, hoping we could use them to defend ourselves. The door creaked open slowly and a figure stepped inside. I couldn't see their face in the dim light, but they were tall, with a build that suggested strength. They didn't say anything, just stood there, watching us. as if waiting for us to make a move. Lisa clutched the knife, her knuckles white. I raised the rifle, trying to steady my shaking hands. But before I could do anything, the figure lunged at us, faster than I could react. The next few seconds were a blur of movement, noise, and fear. I fired the rifle, but the figure was too quick, knocking it out of my hands. Lisa screamed, slashing with the knife, but the figure grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she dropped the blade with a cry of pain. We were overpowered easily, as if we were nothing. The figure didn't kill us, though. Instead, they dragged us out of the cabin, throwing us onto the cold, hard ground outside. I struggled, trying to break free, but it was useless. The figure stood over us, breathing heavily. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, or maybe I was too scared to keep my eyes open. When I came to, it was morning. Lisa was lying beside me, unconscious, but alive. The figure was gone, and so was the map. We stumbled back to civilization, too scared to speak, too shocked to process what had happened. We never told anyone the full story. Who would believe us? But I keep thinking about that cabin, about the logbook filled with names and photos. I wonder how many others went there, thinking they were on an adventure, only to find out too late that they were the prey. And I wonder if one day, the person who hunted us will come back to finish what they started. I never expected a weekend trip to turn into a nightmare. My friends and I were looking for a break, something spontaneous to get away from the stress of city life. We packed our bags, grabbed some snacks, and drove out into the woods, not really knowing where we were going. We didn't care, though. It was all about the adventure. After hours of driving, we found a narrow dirt road leading deeper into the forest. It was almost hidden, like it didn't want to be found. But we were curious, excited even, so we followed it. The trees seemed to close in on us as we drove further, and the sky turned a darker shade of gray. Then we saw it. A small cabin, old and almost hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, but it had a strange pull. It felt like the kind of place where you could disconnect from the world, just what we needed. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. The air felt heavy, like something was watching us, but we brushed it off as city folks' nerves in the wild. We joked about ghost stories, trying to lighten the mood. The door creaked open easily, and the inside was just as you'd expect, dusty, with old furniture and that musty smell of a place long forgotten. But it felt safe, so we decided to stay the night. As the sun set, the cabin became darker, colder. We started a fire in the old fireplace and settled in, talking about nothing in particular. But then, as I was exploring one of the rooms, I noticed something strange. Chains, thick and heavy, were bolted to the wall in one corner, and there were dark stains on the floor beneath them. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but it was there, undeniable. The others came to see what I had found, and the mood changed instantly. The joke stopped, and the reality of our situation hit us like a truck. We searched the cabin more carefully and found more signs. Old, yellowed papers with lists of names, photographs of people who didn't look like they were there by choice, and a hidden trap door leading to a small underground room. The room was worse. It was like something out of a horror movie, small, damp, and with only one exit. The smell was unbearable, and there were marks on the walls, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Panic started to set in. We realized we had stumbled into something terrible, something we were never meant to see. We needed to leave, right then. But as we gathered our things, we heard it, engines in the distance, getting closer. My stomach dropped. Whoever used this cabin was coming back. We had to move fast, but it was already too late. The vehicles were almost at the cabin and there was nowhere to run without being seen. We turned off the lights, hoping the darkness would hide us. We could hear the men talking, their voices low and serious as they got out of their trucks. They weren't far away, just outside, maybe a few meters. Every breath we took felt too loud, every heartbeat like a drum. Then the door opened. They were inside. We couldn't see them, but we could hear their boots on the wooden floor, their whispers. They were looking for something, or someone. I felt a cold sweat on my back, trying to stay as quiet as possible, trying not to even breathe. One wrong move, and they would find us. We had to leave. But how? We couldn't just walk out the front door. We decided to make a break for it, slipping out through the back window while they were still inside. But as we crawled out, one of my friends knocked over a metal bucket. The noise was like a gunshot in the silence. The men were on us immediately. We ran, not thinking about anything but getting away. The forest was dense, branches slapping against our faces, roots tripping us up. I could hear them behind us, getting closer. My heart was pounding, my legs burning, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We reached a cliff, the edge dropping down into a dark ravine. There was nowhere else to go. We turned to face them, knowing this might be the end. They didn't say a word, just came at us, guns pointed. I thought it was over, but then, out of sheer desperation, one of us charged at them, knocking one of the men off balance. The man fell, his scream echoing as he disappeared into the darkness below. The others hesitated for just a second, and that was all we needed. We ran again, this time heading for the road we had come in on. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, faster than I ever had before, with the sound of their shouts behind me. When we finally burst out onto the road, it felt like a miracle. A car was coming, headlights cutting through the dark. We waved it down frantically, begging for help. The driver didn't ask questions, just let us in and sped off. I kept looking back, half expecting to see the men still chasing us, but they never came. We made it out, but not everyone did. I lost friends that night. The memory haunts me, the sound of their screams, the looks on their faces. I can't forget, and I can't forgive myself for what happened. And the worst part? I know those men are still out there, still using that cabin for God knows what. I don't sleep much anymore. When I close my eyes, I see that cabin, hear the sounds of the forest, and feel that cold, creeping fear. I wish we had never taken that trip. I wish we had never found that cabin. Some things are better left hidden in the dark. I went fishing to escape the noise of life. I wanted to be alone, away from the stress. And there's this lake deep in the woods that nobody else seems to know about. It's quiet there, just the sounds of water, birds, and the occasional rustling of leaves, perfect for what I needed. I reached the lake early in the morning, parked my car at the end of a dirt road, and walked a bit to find the perfect spot. I set up my tent near the water, feeling the peace I had been craving for weeks. The sun was barely up, and the mist over the lake made everything seem calm and untouched. It was like I had stepped into a different world, one where nothing could go wrong. Or so I thought. After a few hours of fishing, I started to get bored. The fish weren't biting, so I decided to explore the area a bit. I noticed a narrow path hidden behind some bushes, leading deeper into the forest. The path looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, overgrown and almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Something about it drew me in, maybe curiosity or just wanting to see more of this place I thought was so perfect. I followed the trail for what felt like an hour. The trees grew thicker, the air colder, and then I saw it, a cabin. It was old, the wood weathered and dark, almost blending with the forest around it. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to check it out, like something was pulling me towards it. As I got closer, I saw things that didn't make sense. There were hunting rifles and traps, but also something that made my stomach turn. Bloodstains. Not old, but fresh, like something had been dragged across the ground recently. I should have turned back then. I should have just run back to my camp and left, but I didn't. I kept moving closer, my heart pounding, my mind racing with thoughts I tried to push away. When I reached the cabin door, it was slightly open, creaking as it moved with the wind. I hesitated, but then I heard voices, men talking, getting closer. I panicked and slipped inside, hiding behind some old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The voices grew louder, and soon the door swung open. A group of men walked in, dragging something with them. It took me a second to realize what it was. A person. Their body was limp, lifeless, blood dripping onto the floor. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible, but my mind was screaming, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These men, they weren't hunters, not in the way you'd think. They were something else, something much worse. They talked about the hunt like it was a game, laughing as they described how their prey had tried to run, tried to hide. They talked about people like they were animals, something to be chased down and killed for sport. I needed to get out. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with these men so close. But as I tried to move, my foot brushed against an old tin can, making a sound that echoed through the cabin. The talking stopped. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. One of them turned in my direction, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. I didn't breathe, didn't move, but it was too late. He had heard something, and now they were coming for me. I bolted from my hiding spot, pushing through the door and running as fast as I could back down the trail. Behind me, I heard them yelling, heard their footsteps as they gave chase. The forest that had seemed so peaceful was now a maze of trees and shadows, each one hiding something that could trip me, slow me down, let them catch me. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out, but I couldn't stop. I could hear them getting closer, could feel their presence like a weight on my back. They knew these woods better than I did. They had done this before. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands on the rough ground. Before I could get up, one of them was on me, his hand reaching for my throat. In a surge of fear and desperation, I grabbed a rock and swung it as hard as I could. It connected with his head, and he collapsed, giving me a few precious seconds to get back on my feet and keep running. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember how long I ran, how many times I thought I was done for, only to find some last bit of strength to keep going. But finally, I saw it. A road. I stumbled out of the woods, nearly collapsing as I reached the edge of the asphalt. A car was coming. I waved my arms, screamed for help, and when the driver saw me, he stopped. I must have looked like a madman, covered in dirt and blood, my eyes wild with fear. But he let me in, and I told him to drive, just drive, as far away from there as possible. I don't know how long I sat in that car, shaking, trying to convince myself I was safe. The driver kept asking me what happened, but I couldn't explain it, couldn't put into words the horror of what I had seen, what I had been through. I don't know if he believed me. I'm not sure I believe it myself. I'm home now, but I don't feel safe. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I keep thinking they'll find me, that this isn't over. I keep hearing their voices, seeing their faces when I close my eyes. People say I should talk to someone, but what would I say? That I barely escaped from a group of men who hunt people for fun? I don't know if anyone would believe me. I'm not sure I believe it myself. I never imagined that a simple invitation could change my life forever. I live a pretty lonely life, with few friends and not much going on, so when the invitation arrived, I was surprised. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, just my name on it. The letter inside was short, inviting me to a gathering at a cabin in the woods. It wasn't signed, but it felt like the person knew me, knew the things I struggled with, the loneliness that ate at me. Maybe that's why I decided to go. I thought maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to meet people who understood me. The day of the gathering, I drove out to the cabin. It was far from the city, deep in the woods, where the trees grew close together and the road turned to dirt. I arrived just before sunset, and the cabin was just as isolated as I'd imagined. There were a few cars parked outside, but no one was around. The place was quiet, too quiet. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just nerves. When I walked up to the cabin, the door creaked open before I could knock. A man stood there, smiling, but something about his smile felt wrong. He welcomed me inside, where a few others were already sitting around, talking in low voices. They all looked up at me when I entered, their eyes too sharp, their smiles too wide. I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been waiting for me. The cabin itself was old and musty, the wood creaking underfoot. There were no pictures on the walls, nothing to suggest anyone lived here. I noticed the doors were all locked, heavy bolts sliding into place, and my phone had no signal. It was just us, alone in the middle of nowhere. As the evening went on, the conversation grew stranger. They didn't talk about normal things like work or family. Instead, they spoke in cryptic terms, using words that seemed to have a double meaning. I tried to follow along, but it was like they were speaking a different language, one that only they understood. I felt out of place, like I was the only one who didn't belong. It wasn't long before I realized that something was very wrong. They kept looking at me, more and more, like I was the main attraction. I started to feel trapped, like a mouse caught in a cage. I overheard a whispered conversation between two of the others, and that's when I understood. This wasn't a social gathering. This was a ritual, and I was the reason they were all here. Panic started to rise in my chest. I needed to get out, but when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't budge. The man who had let me in appeared beside me, his smile now a twisted grin. The others were closing in, their eyes dark with intent. "You were chosen," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is why you're here." I didn't wait to hear more. I shoved him aside and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get out of that cabin. I darted down a hallway, desperately searching for a way out. Behind me, I could hear them coming, their footsteps heavy and relentless. I threw open a door and found myself in a small room with a window. Without thinking, I smashed the glass with a chair and climbed through, cutting my hands on the shards. Outside, the night was dark, and the woods were a thick maze of trees and shadows. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes, and the ground was uneven, but I pushed on. I could still hear them behind me, their voices carrying through the trees, calling out to each other, hunting me. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. My lungs were burning, and my legs were about to give out, but fear kept me moving. I finally stumbled upon a dirt road, the same one I had driven in on. In the distance, I saw headlights. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help, and the car stopped. The driver, a middle-aged man, looked at me like I was crazy, but he let me in. I didn't look back as we drove away. I thought I was safe after that, but I was wrong. The events of that night haunt me. I can't sleep without seeing their faces, and I feel like I'm being watched all the time. I moved to a different city, changed my number, tried to start over, but the fear never left. Sometimes I see people watching me, their eyes too sharp, their smiles too wide, just like the ones at the cabin. I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, looking for me, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. I live with the constant fear that one day they'll find me again, that the invitation was just the beginning, and that next time I won't be so lucky. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away. Work was draining me, and my personal life wasn't much better. A few days in the woods, away from everything, sounded perfect. I found the cabin online, a small, cozy place deep in the forest. The pictures looked peaceful, and the price was right. It seemed like exactly what I needed. The drive was long, and by the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The cabin looked just like the photos, a small wooden structure surrounded by trees, no other houses in sight. The isolation was comforting, exactly what I wanted. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the door. The key was under the mat, just like the owner had said. As I pushed open the door, I felt a rush of cold air from inside. That was strange. It was late summer, and the weather had been warm all day. I stepped in and immediately stopped. There was someone sitting in the chair by the fireplace. At first, I thought I had walked into the wrong cabin. But no, this was the place. The man sitting there looked up at me with a calm, almost bored expression. He didn't seem surprised to see me. My heart started to race and I stammered, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked me up and down like he was sizing me up. Then he said in a slow, measured voice, "This is my cabin?" I was confused. "No, I rented this place. You need to leave." He didn't move. He just smiled slightly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe there had been a mistake, or maybe this guy was squatting. I tried to reason with him, explaining that I had booked the cabin for the weekend, that I had the emails to prove it. But he just kept sitting there, his eyes fixed on me with that unsettling smile. "You should go," he said finally, his voice still calm but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Before things get difficult." Something in his tone made it clear that he wasn't just being difficult. There was something more, something dangerous behind those words. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Driving back now, in the dark, wasn't an option I wanted to take. Trying to keep calm, I asked, "What do you mean? What do you want?" His smile widened a bit, and he stood up slowly. "I mean, you're not going anywhere. Not now." Panic started to rise in my chest. I wanted to run, but I felt frozen in place. The man walked closer, and I backed up until I hit the wall. He wasn't very big, but something about him, something in his eyes, made him seem much larger, much more threatening. "You should have listened," he said softly, almost regretfully. I tried to move towards the door, but he blocked my way. The door was so close, but every time I took a step, he moved to block me, almost like he was playing with me. I glanced around the room, looking for anything I could use to defend myself, but there was nothing. Just some old furniture, a fireplace, and a few personal items that weren't mine. That's when it hit me. This man had been staying here for a while, maybe even before I arrived. How long had he been here, waiting? I tried to reason with him again, tried to calm him down, but he just shook his head. "It's too late for that," he said. I don't know what came over me, but I made a break for it, running towards the door. But he was faster than I expected. He grabbed me by the arm and yanked me back with surprising strength. I stumbled and fell, hitting my head on the corner of the table. Pain shot through my skull, and for a moment, everything went dark. When I came to, I was on the floor, and the man was standing over me, looking down with that same cold, detached expression. "You really shouldn't have done that," he said. His voice was calm, like he was talking about the weather. I tried to get up, but my head was spinning and my vision was blurry. I could barely think, but one thought cut through the fog. He wasn't going to let me leave. I was trapped here, with him. He must have seen the realization on my face because he nodded slightly. "That's right. You're staying here, with me." I don't know how long I lay there, trying to come up with a plan, any plan to get out of there. But every time I thought I had an opening, he would move, cutting off my escape. It was like he knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it. Every time I tried to move, he was there, just a step ahead of me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I scrambled to my feet and lunged at him, hoping to catch him off guard. But he was ready. He grabbed me and threw me down again, this time harder. I felt something crack in my side, and the pain was so intense I couldn't breathe. He stood over me, watching as I struggled to get up, his face still calm, almost bored. "You can't win," he said softly. "This cabin is mine. You're not leaving." I don't know how I managed to get back to my feet, but I did. I was running on pure adrenaline, on the desperate need to survive. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it at him. It connected, and he staggered back, surprise flashing across his face. But then he recovered, and the calmness returned. "Do you think this will help you?" he asked, almost amused. He stepped towards me again, and I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The door was blocked, the windows were too small to fit through, and he was getting closer. As he closed in, I realized with cold, sinking dread that he was right. There was no escape. The cabin was a trap, and I was caught in it. He had planned everything, and now there was nothing I could do. My only hope was to keep fighting, but deep down, I knew it was hopeless. And as he finally reached me, as his hands closed around my throat, I understood that this was how it would end. Alone, in the middle of nowhere, in a cabin I should never have come to. My last thought before the darkness closed in was that I should have listened to the warning signs, but by then, it was too late. I shouldn't have been there. I knew that as soon as I stepped into that alley, just a few seconds too late to turn back. They were talking, those men, and what they said, it was the kind of thing you can't unhear. I tried to move quietly, to back away before they noticed me, but the bottle I kicked gave me away. They turned, faces hidden in shadows, and before I could run, one of them yelled, "Get him!" So, I ran. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like forever. My lungs burned, my legs wanted to give out, but I couldn't stop. I kept looking back, sure I'd see them closing in, but the darkness swallowed everything behind me. My foot caught on something and I went down hard, skinning my hands and knees. I got up and saw it, an old cabin, barely visible through the trees. I staggered toward it, hoping it would save me. I shoved the door open and collapsed inside, gasping for air. The cabin was cold, musty, and dark, but at least it was shelter. My heart still pounded in my ears as I listened, waiting to hear footsteps or voices outside, but there was only silence. I told myself I was safe, but it was hard to believe. I forced myself up and searched for something, anything, to block the door. That's when I noticed something strange about the place. The cabin didn't look abandoned, not really. The furniture was old, but it wasn't dusty like you'd expect. There were marks on the walls like scratches, and something metal glinted in the dim light. I moved closer, squinting to see what it was. A thin wire, stretched across the floor, almost invisible. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a wire, it was connected to something, something hidden behind the wall. I followed it with my eyes and saw more wires, all leading to different parts of the cabin. And then it hit me. This place was a trap. I tried to back away, but my foot caught on something again, and this time I heard a click. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a second, nothing happened, and I thought maybe it was all in my head. But then a blade shot out from the wall, missing my face by inches. I stumbled back, heart racing, realizing just how close I'd come to dying. I needed to get out. I moved slowly, carefully, trying not to touch anything else. But every step felt like a risk. The whole place was a death trap. Who would set up something like this? My mind was spinning, but I couldn't afford to think. I had to focus on surviving. I reached the door and peered out. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I wondered if the men were still out there, searching for me. But before I could decide what to do, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, crunching through the underbrush, getting closer. They were here. I slammed the door shut and backed away, frantically looking around for a place to hide. The cabin was small, too small. There was nowhere to go. I heard the door creak open, and I knew they were inside. I pressed myself against the wall, praying they wouldn't see me. But then something happened. One of them must have tripped a wire, because suddenly the room was filled with the sound of gears turning and metal grinding. The men shouted, panicked, but it was too late. The traps sprang to life. I heard a sickening thud, followed by a scream, and then silence. I didn't dare move. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the sweat dripping down my back. I knew the traps were resetting, getting ready to strike again. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, a man, one of the criminals, still alive, crawling toward me. His eyes were wild with fear, but I couldn't help him. If I moved, the traps would get us both. He reached out, as if begging for help. But before I could decide what to do, there was another click. A blade swung down, and then he was gone. I bit back a scream, trying not to lose it, but I couldn't stay here. The traps were closing in, and I knew that if I didn't get out, I'd be next. I moved, inching along the wall, avoiding the wires. Every step was a gamble, but I couldn't stop. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and I could still hear the mechanical noises, reminding me that death was everywhere in this place. Finally, I saw it. A small window, just big enough to crawl through. I made my way toward it, praying it wasn't rigged. But just as I reached it, I heard another set of footsteps. One of them had survived. I froze, not daring to breathe. And then I saw him, a shadow moving through the cabin, searching for me. He was between me and the door, but the window was still open. He didn't see me, not at first. I waited until he turned his back. Then I made my move. I lunged for the window, but as I did, I heard the sound of metal scraping against stone. I looked back and saw him, just in time, as he triggered the last trap. The blade came down and he screamed, but I didn't wait to see what happened next. I threw myself through the window, landing hard on the ground outside. I didn't stop to look back. I ran, my body screaming in pain, but I didn't care. I had to get away from that place, from the cabin and the traps and the death that waited inside. I kept running until I couldn't run anymore, until the cabin was far behind me, lost in the darkness of the woods. I don't know how I survived, but I did. I kept going, kept moving, until I found a road, a car, and someone to help me. But even now, I can still hear the sound of those traps, the grinding of gears and the click of the wires. And I know I'll never be free of that cabin. I may have escaped, but part of me is still there, waiting for the next victim. I decided to go hiking alone, something I've done many times before. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, just me and the quiet of the forest. The trail I chose was in a remote area, far from the usual places where tourists gather. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise of the city, to clear my mind. The day started well. The sun was shining through the trees, casting a warm light on the path ahead. The air was fresh, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. I was happy to be there, away from everything, just walking with my thoughts. But that feeling didn't last long. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed them. At first it was just a glimpse, a few men standing together in the distance, maybe 100 meters away. They weren't hiking. They were just standing there, watching. I told myself it was nothing, just some locals or maybe other hikers. But when I looked back again, they were closer, still watching. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the unease that was building inside me. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being followed. The men were getting closer, and the path seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, with no sign of an end. I stopped to catch my breath, hoping they would pass by, but they didn't. They stopped too, just a few steps behind me now. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, so I started running. I'm not sure how long I ran, but it felt like hours. My legs were burning, my breath coming in short gasps. But I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. The sound of their footsteps was close behind, getting louder with every step. I pushed myself harder, hoping to lose them in the thick trees, but it was no use. They were too fast, too strong. I stumbled, falling hard on the rough ground. Before I could get up, they were on me. Rough hands grabbed me, pulling me up and dragging me through the forest. I kicked and screamed, but it didn't matter. They were stronger, and there were too many of them. I couldn't fight them off. They took me to a cabin hidden deep in the woods, a place I never would have found on my own. It was old and run down, the kind of place that makes you think of bad things. They threw me inside, locking the door behind me. I was trapped. Inside the cabin, the men didn't say much, just a few words that made my blood run cold. "You're going to play a game," one of them said, his voice low and menacing. "You have 1 hour to get out of these woods. If you can make it, you live. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I knew what he meant. They gave me a head start, not that it made much difference. I ran again, through the thick forest, not knowing where I was going. The trees were tall and dark, blocking out the light. Every sound made me jump, branches snapping underfoot, the wind rustling the leaves, my own breath echoing in my ears. The laughter started soon after I left the cabin. It was distant at first, but it got closer, louder. They were hunting me, playing with me like I was nothing but prey. I kept running, pushing myself beyond what I thought I could do. But no matter how fast I ran, they were always there, just behind me. I stumbled over roots, scratched my arms and legs on sharp branches, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, it would be the end. My body was screaming for me to rest, but my mind wouldn't let me. The fear was too strong, driving me forward even when I thought I had nothing left. Then, out of nowhere, one of them appeared in front of me. He smiled, a twisted, cruel smile that made my stomach turn. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed a rock from the ground and swung it with all my strength. The rock connected with his head, and he went down, hard. I didn't wait to see if he was dead. I just ran. But as I made my way through the trees, something changed. The forest felt different, darker. It was like the trees were closing in, blocking my way. And then I realized I was lost. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a heavy silence. I slowed down, trying to get my bearings, but it was no use. Every direction looked the same, the trees all blending together in the dim light. I was trapped in the forest, and I knew the other men were still out there, waiting. I don't know how long I wandered, but it felt like hours. My legs were weak, my body trembling with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw them, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. They didn't move, just stared with those cold, calculating eyes. I turned and ran again, but it was no use. The forest seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, leading me in circles. I was trapped, and I knew it. But I couldn't stop running. Not until my body gave out, and I collapsed on the ground, too exhausted to move. I don't know what happened after that. I woke up in the same spot, alone. The men were gone, but the fear was still there, gripping me tight. I made my way out of the forest, but it didn't feel like I had escaped. It felt like they were still watching, waiting. I don't know what happened to those men, or if they're still out there, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That one day, they'll come back for me, and this time, I won't be able to get away. It was late October when I decided to rent a cabin in the woods. I found it on Craigslist. The ad was simple, saying, "Cozy cabin, secluded, perfect for a quiet getaway." The photos showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees. The price was low, almost too low, but I needed a break from the city. My mind was a mess, and I thought a few days alone would help clear my head. The drive took longer than I expected. The directions were not clear, and my GPS lost signal miles before I got to the cabin. By the time I arrived, it was nearly dark. The cabin looked like the photos, but something about it felt wrong. The air was cold and damp, smelling like wet leaves and pine. The silence was heavy, like the forest was waiting for something. Inside, the cabin was small but okay. There was an old couch, a wood-burning stove, and a tiny kitchen. I put my bag down and looked around. The bedroom was just a bed and a nightstand. No curtains on the windows, so I could see the trees outside getting darker as the night came. That first night, nothing happened. I was tired from the long drive and fell asleep quickly. But around midnight, I woke up. There was a strange noise, like something scratching, but it was so faint I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I stayed still, listening, but the noise stopped. After a while, I went back to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, and the trees seemed closer the further I walked. After a while, I found an old trail, overgrown and almost hidden. It led to a small clearing with a stone well in the center. The well was covered in moss, with roots twisting around it like they were trying to pull it underground. It looked old, forgotten. I felt uneasy standing there, like I wasn't supposed to be there. So, I went back to the cabin. That night, the scratching noise came back, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the walls. I turned on the lights, and the noise stopped. I checked the cabin inside and out, but there was nothing. The forest outside was dark, the trees just shadows against the night sky. I felt like someone or something was watching me, but I tried to ignore it and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. The scratching started again, louder and more constant. It was like it was inside my head, driving me crazy. I grabbed a flashlight and searched the whole cabin. The noise kept moving, always just out of reach. I even checked under the floorboards, but there was nothing there. Finally, tired and frustrated, I gave up and went back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from a monster. In the morning, I found deep scratches on the walls, fresh gouges in the wood that hadn't been there before. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, but I didn't really believe that. It felt like something was playing with me, trying to scare me. The third night was the worst. The scratching never stopped, relentless, echoing through the cabin like it was trying to get inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, ready to leave, even though it was the middle of the night. But when I opened the door, the forest was different. The trees were closer. The branches tangled together like they were alive, blocking the path. It was like the forest had closed in on me, trapping me. I panicked and ran back inside, bolting the door behind me. The scratching grew louder, coming from all around, inside the walls, under the floor, even from the ceiling. It was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise, heavy and pressing down on me. I didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell, but nothing came. The only sound was my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. I stayed awake all night, too scared to close my eyes. When dawn finally came, I cautiously opened the door. The forest looked normal again, the path clear. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and fled, not looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was small and lonely in the distance, but just before it disappeared from view, I saw something in the window, a dark shape, watching me leave. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? It sounds like a bad horror movie, but I know what I saw, what I heard. And every night when I lie in bed, I still hear that scratching, faint and distant, like it's trying to find me again. My girlfriend and I thought we needed this trip. We had been arguing a lot, mostly over stupid things. So when I found a cabin in the woods, away from the city noise, I thought it was the perfect place to reconnect. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The cabin was small, simple, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to close in as darkness fell. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself it was what we needed. The first night was supposed to be peaceful. We had dinner, played some old board games we found in the cabin, and drank wine by the fire. Everything seemed fine until I went outside to get more firewood. That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper pinned to the door with a rusty nail. The handwriting was messy, almost like a child's, but the message was clear. I'm watching you. I froze for a second, the cold air biting into my skin. I went back inside, trying not to alarm her, but she noticed something was wrong. I showed her the note and we both tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably a joke, maybe left by some local kids. But deep down, I could tell she was just as scared as I was. We locked the doors and windows, double-checking everything before going to bed. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me jump. The wind against the cabin, the creaking of the old wooden floor, everything seemed too loud. I kept thinking about that note, wondering who could have left it and why. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. We had breakfast on the small porch, and the sunlight made things feel almost normal again. But then, as I went to get the car keys from the cabin, I found another note on the table. This time, it wasn't vague. Leave now, or you'll regret it. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been inside while we slept. I checked the locks again, but everything was still secure. How could someone get in without us noticing? My girlfriend was starting to panic, saying we should leave immediately, but I told her it was probably still a prank. I tried to sound confident, but I was terrified. As the day went on, we both became more paranoid. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone watching us from the trees. We barely talked, both of us lost in our thoughts, jumping at every little noise. I started noticing things were out of place. My phone wasn't where I left it, a chair was slightly moved, and the back door lock seemed a bit loose. Whoever was doing this knew what they were doing. They wanted us scared, and it was working. By the third night, we were barely holding it together. We hadn't left the cabin all day, too afraid to go outside. That evening, I found another note, even more disturbing than the last. I know you're scared. I can see it. It was almost like they were enjoying this, watching us slowly lose our minds. We argued again, this time louder, angrier. She begged me to leave, to pack our things and go. But I was too stubborn, too angry that someone was messing with us. I wanted to confront them, to make them stop. That night, we heard the footsteps. They started softly, like someone was trying to be quiet, then got louder, circling the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and told her to stay inside. She was crying, pleading with me not to go, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I stepped outside, shining the light into the trees, trying to find whoever was out there. But all I saw was darkness, the trees looking back at me like silent watchers. The footsteps stopped, and I stood there, listening to my own heavy breathing, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally went back inside, she was gone. The cabin was empty, and there was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no open doors. Just another note on the floor. You should have left. I screamed her name, running through the cabin, checking every room, every corner. But she was gone, like she had never been there at all. I ran outside, shouting for her, but the only answer was the wind through the trees. I kept searching, even though I knew it was hopeless. I could feel the walls closing in, the darkness pressing down on me. I don't know how long I searched, maybe hours, maybe just minutes. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. All I knew was that she was gone, and it was my fault. In the end, I found nothing. No trace of her, no more notes, nothing but the silence of the woods. I sat on the porch, staring into the dark, too tired to keep looking, too scared to go back inside. I kept thinking about that last note, wondering what it meant, wondering if she was still out there, somewhere close, watching me. I left the next morning, as soon as the sun came up. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't explain it, and I knew no one would believe me. But I still see her in my dreams, standing at the edge of the woods, just out of reach, always watching. And I still hear those footsteps, circling the cabin, getting closer and closer every night. I needed a break from everything, so I decided to go camping alone. It was something I always wanted to do, and I knew the perfect place. A small old cabin deep in the woods, far from any town. No cell service, no noise, just nature and peace. I packed my bag with everything I needed and set off early in the morning. The drive was long, the road winding through thick forests that seemed to swallow the light. I reached the cabin by afternoon. It was just as I remembered. Quiet, a little run down, but cozy. I unpacked, made a small fire outside, and sat, listening to the sounds of the forest. As the sun started to set, I noticed something strange. A car, an old beat-up sedan, slowly made its way up the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. This was odd. I was supposed to be alone out here. I watched as it stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, the engine still running. I couldn't see who was inside because the windows were tinted. I felt a chill, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were lost, or just other campers. But the car didn't move, and after a while, the engine turned off. The car just sat there in the growing darkness. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, but I went inside and locked the door, hoping they would leave by morning. When I woke up the next day, the car was still there, but now the driver's door was open and there was no one inside. I stepped outside, cautiously looking around, but the woods were silent. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps, several pairs of heavy boots crunching on the dirt. 3 men emerged from the trees, moving quickly toward me. They looked rough, dirty, and their eyes were wild, like animals. One of them, taller and more intimidating than the others, stepped forward. "We're staying here," he said, his voice cold. "You don't have a choice." I tried to reason with them, asking if they were lost or needed help, but the tall man just laughed, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "No, we're not lost. We're hiding. Cops will be looking for us soon, so you better keep quiet." My heart sank. I realized these men weren't just drifters. They were criminals, probably on the run after something went wrong. I was trapped. My peaceful getaway had turned into a nightmare. They pushed me back into the cabin, where they made themselves at home, taking my food, my supplies. The tall man, clearly the leader, kept a close eye on me, his hand always near his pocket, where I guessed he had a gun. The hours dragged on, the men arguing among themselves, their voices growing louder, angrier. The tension was thick, and I could feel their paranoia increasing with each passing minute. I tried to stay calm, pretending to be cooperative, but inside I was terrified. Every word, every movement could set them off. I had to think of a way out, but nothing came to mind. That evening, as they argued again, this time over who was to blame for their situation, I noticed something. The leader was losing control of his group. The other 2 didn't seem to respect him much anymore. This was my chance. I just needed a moment when they were distracted. Later that night, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, I saw my opportunity. They were all focused on the leader, who was angrily waving his gun at one of the men. I quietly slipped out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The night was dark, the trees casting long shadows, but I didn't care. I ran, sprinting into the woods as fast as I could. I didn't get far. Behind me, I heard the leader shout, then the sound of footsteps, loud, fast, getting closer. The branches scratched at my face and arms as I stumbled through the undergrowth, the cold air burning my lungs. But no matter how fast I ran, he was faster. I felt his hand grab my shoulder, yanking me back. I fell hard, my face hitting the ground. "You think you can get away?" he hissed, dragging me to my feet. "You're just making this worse for yourself." He marched me back to the cabin where the others waited, their eyes full of anger and fear. They were all on edge, and I knew the situation was about to explode. The leader threw me down in the corner and started yelling at the others, blaming them for my escape attempt. Suddenly, one of the men snapped. He lunged at the leader, trying to wrestle the gun from his hands. The room erupted into chaos. They fought, knocking over furniture, shouting and cursing. In the confusion, I spotted a heavy metal flashlight on the floor. I didn't think. I just grabbed it and swung as hard as I could at the leader's head. He dropped like a stone, the gun slipping from his hand. The other 2 stopped fighting, staring at me in shock. Without wasting a second, I picked up the gun and pointed it at them, my hands shaking. They backed away, their faces pale. I didn't know if I could actually pull the trigger, but I didn't have to. They were more afraid of each other than of me. With the leader unconscious and the gun in my hands, their resolve crumbled. One of them bolted out the door, disappearing into the night. The other stayed frozen in place, too scared to move. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I ran. This time I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, until I found a road, until I found help. It's been weeks since that night, but I still can't sleep. The sounds of the forest, once so comforting, now fill me with dread. The memory of those men, their faces twisted in fear and anger, haunts me every time I close my eyes. I escaped, but a part of me is still trapped in that cabin, still running through those dark woods. I woke up on the cold, hard floor. My head pounded, and when I opened my eyes, I saw a small, dimly lit room. The light came from a single, dirty window. I didn't know where I was, and that made my heart race. I tried to remember the last thing I did, but it was like my memories were just out of reach. I had no idea how I got here or why I was here. My mouth was dry, and I felt weak as I pushed myself up to sit. My eyes scanned the room quickly, searching for anything familiar, but there was nothing. I got to my feet, feeling dizzy for a moment. The room was empty except for an old wooden chair that was broken, lying on its side. The walls had deep scratches in them, like someone or something had clawed at them in a desperate attempt to get out. I didn't want to think about what that could mean. A trail of blood led from the middle of the room to the door. I took a step back, my heart pounding harder. I searched the room, hoping to find something that could help me. In a small corner, I found a rusty knife, the kind that you would use for gutting fish, and a few cans of food. I picked up the knife, feeling a little better with something to defend myself, though the rust on the blade didn't make it feel very reliable. Still, it was better than nothing. I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from somewhere, but when I looked around, there was no one. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow and heavy, getting closer to the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly looked for a place to hide. There was nowhere to go. I ended up ducking behind the broken chair, though it wouldn't do much to hide me. The door creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure step inside. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure the person could hear it. The figure moved around the room, searching, but they didn't seem to see me. After a few long minutes, they left, closing the door behind them. I stayed still for a while, trying to make sense of what was happening. Someone was hunting me. Why? I had no idea, but I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. My mind raced as I thought about the best way to escape. The blood on the floor. Whose blood was it? I couldn't think about that now. I had to focus on getting out alive. I slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cold, and the forest around the cabin was dark and thick. The trees seemed to close in on me from every direction. I started running, hoping to find a way out, but the forest was like a maze. I had no idea where I was going. As I ran, I tripped over something thin and sharp, and suddenly there was a loud snap. Pain shot through my leg as a trap closed around my ankle. I screamed, dropping to the ground. The trap had sharp teeth that dug into my flesh, and blood started to pour out. I tried to pry the trap open, but it wouldn't budge. I was stuck. My mind was racing, and I was sure the person hunting me would hear my scream and come running. I had to do something. I forced myself to focus, ignoring the pain. I managed to find a rock nearby and used it to wedge open the trap just enough to pull my leg out. My ankle was bleeding badly, and I could barely stand, but I knew I had to keep moving. I was being hunted, and I couldn't stay in one place. I limped back to the cabin, thinking it might be my best chance to set a trap of my own. The knife was all I had, but it would have to do. I found a piece of rope in the corner of the cabin and used it to set up a crude trap at the door. It wasn't much, but it was all I could think of. My leg throbbed with pain, and I knew I was losing blood. I just had to hold out a little longer. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. I couldn't tell. I was so tired and weak. Then I heard the footsteps again. The door creaked open, and the shadowy figure stepped inside. My heart stopped as they walked into the room, triggering the trap. The rope tightened around their legs, and they fell hard onto the floor. I didn't wait. I jumped at them with the knife, stabbing wildly. There was a struggle, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, the figure stopped moving, and I fell back, gasping for breath. Blood was everywhere. I didn't feel like I had won. My leg was still bleeding, and I knew I had to get out of here. I stumbled through the woods, not caring where I was going. I just had to get away. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I reached a road. I was so tired that I almost didn't notice the car approaching. I waved it down, desperate for help. The car stopped, and a man got out. He looked at me with concern, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. He looked familiar, too familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but then memories started to come back in flashes. The man from the cabin, the one I had just fought, it was him. Or was it? My mind was spinning, and I couldn't trust my own thoughts anymore. The man asked if I needed help, his voice calm, too calm. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Was this real? Was I still in danger? I couldn't tell. I got into the car, my heart racing. As we drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake. I'm writing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there can learn from our mistake. We were 5 friends who decided to take a weekend hike in the remote mountains. We planned everything: gear, food, maps, everything except the weather. It changed fast, too fast for us to react properly. What started as a mild drizzle turned into a full-blown storm within minutes. We were caught in the middle of it, miles from civilization, soaked to the bone, and no idea where to go. We were desperate to find shelter, and then, as if by some twisted stroke of luck, we stumbled upon an old cabin deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, with its crooked roof and peeling paint, but it was a roof over our heads. We didn't hesitate for a second. We went inside and felt a wave of relief as the storm raged on outside. The inside of the cabin was dark, with the smell of damp wood and dust filling the air. We lit some candles we found in a drawer and settled in. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found this place, but that feeling didn't last long. As we explored, something felt off. The cabin wasn't as abandoned as we first thought. Fresh food was on the table, and footprints could be seen in the dust on the floor. At first, we thought maybe a hunter or someone else had been staying here recently. But then, one of my friends found a door hidden behind a false wall. We all gathered around as he forced it open, revealing a small room packed with things that made our blood run cold. Guns, stacks of money, and documents with names and photos. We weren't alone. This wasn't just some forgotten cabin. It was a safe house for a crime syndicate. We panicked. Some wanted to leave immediately, but the storm was still going strong, and there was no guarantee we'd make it back without getting lost or worse. Others thought we should wait it out until morning, hoping that no one would come. That's when we saw the headlights approaching the cabin. We scrambled to hide. The cabin didn't offer much, but we found places, under beds, in closets, anywhere we could fit. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they'd hear it. I was tucked behind a stack of old boxes, barely breathing as I heard the car door slam and footsteps on the porch. The door creaked open, and the sound of voices filled the cabin. They were here, the syndicate members, and they were not happy. I could hear them cursing and arguing. Then, suddenly, they went silent. One of them had noticed something out of place. The hidden door we had opened. They found us quickly after that. One by one, they dragged us out of our hiding spots, forcing us to sit in the middle of the room. The leader of the group, A man with a cold, hard face looked us over as if deciding what to do with us. I caught bits of their conversation. They were talking about how we had seen too much and that they couldn't let us leave. My heart sank as I realized that they were serious. We were tied up, hands behind our backs, and left on the floor under guard while the others discussed our fate. It was clear they planned to get rid of us once the storm passed. One of my friends, trying to be brave, spoke up, trying to bargain, but it only made things worse. The leader snapped, hitting him across the face and telling us all to shut up. Time dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. The guard watching over us was young, maybe just a few years older than us, but there was no mercy in his eyes. I could see the fear in my friends' faces, and I'm sure mine wasn't much different. We all knew what was coming. As dawn began to break, the storm finally started to ease. The light of morning filtered through the cabin's dirty windows, casting an eerie glow on our situation. I knew we didn't have much time left. Rescue wasn't coming, and no one knew where we were. If we were going to survive, we had to act. I whispered to my friends, trying to come up with a plan. It wasn't much, just a desperate attempt to overpower the guard when he least expected it. We were weak, scared, and unarmed, but it was the only chance we had. We waited for the right moment, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to spring. The guard had let his attention slip just a little, probably thinking there was no way we'd try anything. That's when we made our move, and that's where I have to stop. I can't go on, not yet. The rest, well, it's still too fresh, too raw. All I can say is that we did what we had to do, and I'm here to tell the story. But the others, some didn't make it. And the nightmares, they don't stop. I keep wondering if there was another way, something we could have done differently. Maybe if we had just left that cabin alone. So if you're ever out in the woods and you come across an abandoned cabin, don't go inside. No matter how bad the storm is, no matter how cold or wet you are, just keep moving. Because sometimes shelter isn't the safe option. Sometimes it's the beginning of a nightmare. I rented the cabin to finish my novel, or at least that's what I told myself. In truth, I was running away. The noise of the city, the constant interruptions, everything was too much. The silence of the woods promised peace, a chance to finally focus. I thought being alone would help. I was wrong. The cabin was as isolated as advertised. No neighbors, no nearby roads, just trees and silence. It should have been perfect. The first day, I barely wrote a sentence. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, like the trees were watching me. But I convinced myself that it was just nerves. Tomorrow would be better. That night, the knock came. It was loud, echoing through the small cabin, and it made my heart jump. No one should be here. No one even knew where I was. I opened the door, and there he was. A man, his shirt soaked in blood. He stumbled inside without waiting for an invitation, mumbling about someone chasing him, someone who wanted him dead. He looked terrified, and his words were jumbled, like he couldn't get them out fast enough. My first instinct was to help him, to do something about his wounds. I grabbed some towels and tried to stop the bleeding, but as I worked, doubts crept in. Who was this man? Why was he here, in the middle of nowhere? And who was after him? He kept looking out the window, flinching at every sound. His hands were shaking, and I could feel his fear, but something felt off. His story didn't make sense. He said he had been hiking when he was attacked, but there was no backpack, no gear, nothing to suggest he was out for a hike. The more he talked, the more confused I became. I asked him for details, tried to understand, but his answers were vague, inconsistent. He'd say one thing, then contradict himself moments later. He claimed he didn't know his attacker, but then he mentioned a name, James, I think, before quickly changing the subject. I started to feel that familiar tension again, the one I thought I left in the city. But this time, it was different. It was fear. Night had fallen completely by now, and the cabin felt smaller, the walls closer. I heard noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. The stranger noticed my unease and tried to calm me down, but his words only made things worse. He kept saying we were safe inside, that whoever was out there wouldn't find us. It sounded more like a warning than reassurance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The blood on his clothes wasn't just from the cuts I could see. There was too much of it. And his eyes. They darted around, never settling on one thing for too long. When I asked him about the blood, he gave a nervous laugh and said it was nothing, that he'd just had a rough time escaping. But it didn't add up. I felt trapped, unsure whether to believe him or throw him out. Then, the phone rang. I didn't expect it to work out here, but I grabbed it like it was a lifeline. It was the police doing a routine check-in on the area. I told them about the man, about his injuries, and the officer on the other end went quiet for a moment. Then, he asked me to describe the man. When I did, his tone changed. He told me to stay calm, but I could hear the urgency in his voice. He said they'd send someone over right away and warned me not to let the man out of my sight. That was when I knew I was in real danger. I hung up and turned to find the stranger going through my stuff. He was searching for something, tossing my things aside like they didn't matter. I asked him what he was doing, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside I was panicking. He stopped and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something different in his eyes. Not fear, but calculation. He said he was looking for a phone, something to call for help. But I didn't believe him. His story, his wounds, everything was a lie. I told him to leave, but he just smiled and moved closer. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I backed away, trying to think of an escape, but he was between me and the door. I had nowhere to go. He started talking again, this time more calmly, explaining that he wasn't the one in danger. I was. He said he had made a mistake, that he shouldn't have come here, but now it was too late. His words were calm, almost gentle, but they only made my fear grow. Just as I was about to make a desperate move, there was another knock at the door. This one was quieter, but it sent a chill down my spine. The stranger froze, his face going pale. He whispered that it wasn't safe, that we shouldn't open it. But I was already moving, my hand reaching for the doorknob, hoping against hope that the police had arrived. I hesitated, my hand trembling, as I realized I didn't know who or what was on the other side. The stranger stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. I turned the knob slowly, my heart in my throat, and the door began to open. The story ends here. I don't know who was at the door. It could have been the police, or maybe it was the person the stranger had warned me about. All I know is that I was trapped, caught between a man I couldn't trust and a danger I couldn't see. The last thing I remember is the door creaking open, the darkness outside seeming to reach in, and the feeling that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to like it. We finally reached the cabin after a long drive. My wife, kids, and I were all tired but excited to spend some time away from the city. The place looked perfect. A small wooden cabin in the middle of the forest, just like in the pictures. There was no cell service, but that was part of the charm. We needed a break from our phones and the constant noise of our lives. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet, almost. No sounds of birds, just the wind through the trees. My daughter Lily was the first to point out something odd. She was running around exploring the cabin when she asked why there were so many tiny holes in the walls. At first, I didn't think much of it. The place was old, probably had a few quirks. My wife, Sarah, said it was nothing to worry about. We spent the day unpacking, playing board games, and enjoying the peace. The kids loved the place, and I was starting to relax. I even forgot about the holes in the walls. But that evening, things started to feel strange. We were having dinner when my son, Jack, accidentally knocked over a bookshelf. It wasn't a big crash, just a few books falling to the floor, but it revealed something I wish we had never seen. Behind the books, there was a small camera, hidden between the shelves, pointing straight at us. At first, I thought it was some old, unused camera left by the previous owner. Maybe they used it for security, I told myself, but when I pulled it out, I realized it was still warm. It was on. My heart began to race as I searched the rest of the cabin. I found more cameras hidden in the corners, in the vents, even behind picture frames. They were all pointing towards where we spent most of our time, watching us. Sarah started to panic, and I didn't blame her. We had been here less than a day, and someone had been watching us the whole time. I tried to use the landline phone to call for help, but there was no dial tone, just silence. I grabbed the car keys and rushed outside, telling the kids to stay with their mother. But when I tried to start the car, it just wouldn't turn on. The engine made a sad clicking noise, but that was it. We were trapped. Sarah suggested we should barricade ourselves inside until we figured out what to do. I wanted to believe that staying inside would keep us safe, but I knew we couldn't just wait. Whoever was watching us knew this cabin well. They knew the area, and they knew we were cut off from the outside world. I didn't want to think about what they had planned, but I could feel the dread growing inside me. We decided to leave the cabin on foot, hoping to find help. There had to be another cabin or a ranger station somewhere nearby. We grabbed what we could: flashlights, a few snacks, a map I had seen in the cabin, and we left. As we walked through the woods, the sun started to set, and everything became more terrifying. Every crack of a branch made us jump. The kids were quiet, holding hands as they walked close to us. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my fear getting worse with every step. Then we found it. A small shed, hidden between the trees, almost impossible to see from the path. It looked old, abandoned, but something about it drew me in. I had to see what was inside. When I opened the door, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Inside, there were screens, old and dusty, but still on. They showed different parts of the cabin: the kitchen, the living room, even the kids' bedroom. There were wires everywhere, connected to recording equipment. Someone had been watching us, recording our every move, and probably doing the same to others before us. It was clear now that we weren't just being spied on. We were being hunted. I wanted to smash everything in that shed, destroy every camera, every piece of equipment, but I knew it wouldn't solve our problem. The person behind this could be anywhere. They could be watching us even now, waiting for the right moment to do whatever they planned. We couldn't stay there. We had to keep moving, but every step felt heavier. The darkness was closing in, and I didn't know if we could make it to safety before something terrible happened. As we stumbled through the woods, I heard something behind us. Footsteps, quick and quiet. I turned, shining my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing. My mind was racing, imagining someone lurking just out of sight, waiting for us to let our guard down. We finally reached a small clearing, and I decided to make a stand. We couldn't keep running. I told Sarah to take the kids and keep going, while I stayed behind, ready to face whoever was after us. I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I held the flashlight like a weapon. Then, out of the darkness, a figure appeared, tall, shadowy, and holding something in their hand. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body against the trees. I didn't wait. I charged at them, swinging the flashlight with all my strength. I don't know if I hit them or if they dodged, but I felt a sharp pain in my side as I collided with the ground. Everything went black for a moment, and when I came to, the figure was gone. I struggled to my feet, breathing heavily, and stumbled back to where I had left Sarah and the kids. When I found them, they were huddled together, scared but unharmed. We kept moving, not stopping until we finally saw the lights of a small town in the distance. We made it, but I knew we would never be the same. The cabin, the cameras, the person watching us. It was all too real. Even now, safe in our home, I still feel like someone is watching. Every time I close my eyes, I see those screens showing every move we made, every moment we thought was private. And I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that somewhere, someone is still watching, waiting for their next chance. I thought I had caught a break when I got the call about the cabin. The guy on the other end sounded desperate, which suited me fine. I was desperate too. Rent was due, and jobs were scarce. So when he offered good money to fix up an old cabin in the woods, I didn't hesitate. I figured it would be a quiet job, maybe even a chance to clear my head. I was wrong. The cabin was farther out than I expected, deep in a forest that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The place was old, with a roof that sagged and walls that looked like they'd seen better days decades ago. But it was nothing I couldn't handle. I unloaded my tools and got to work, focusing on the roof first. I noticed the scratches on the floor almost right away. Long, deep gouges like something had been dragged across the wood. At first, I thought it was just damage from furniture or animals, but they were too deliberate, too violent. Then there were the stains. They looked like water damage, but the color was off, darker, almost like rust. I tried not to think about it too much. Old places like this had stories, most of them boring. I convinced myself it was just wear and tear from years of neglect, but still, something about it gnawed at me. On the second day, I found the storage space. It was hidden under a loose floorboard in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just checking the floor for rot, when I noticed the board shift under my weight. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pried it up. Inside was a box, old and covered in dust. I pulled it out and opened it, expecting to find maybe some old tools or junk left behind. Instead, I found photographs. Dozens of them, all black and white, showing people bound and gagged. Their faces twisted in fear, their eyes pleading. My hands shook as I flipped through them, each one worse than the last. Then I found the journal. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic. As I read through the entries, my stomach turned. It wasn't just random ramblings. This was a record of the terrible things that happened in the cabin. The details were too vivid, too real to be fiction. It was like the writer was proud of what they'd done, bragging about it in the most sickening way. I dropped the journal like it burned me, scrambling to my feet. I should have left right then. I knew I should have packed up and gotten the hell out of there, but I couldn't. The money. I needed it, and besides, who was going to believe me if I told them about the box? So, I shoved everything back in the hole and tried to convince myself it wasn't my problem. But it was my problem. The next day, I noticed movement in the woods. At first, I thought it was just my nerves, but then I saw them. Figures, watching me from the tree line. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me. My heart pounded, and I had to force myself to keep working, pretending I didn't see them. That night, as I lay on the old creaky bed in the cabin, I got the first message. A single piece of paper slid under the door. I jumped up, rushing to the door. But when I threw it open, there was no one there, just the note, with 3 words scrawled in black ink: leave, or else. My hands shook as I read it, over and over, trying to make sense of it. I knew it was about the box, about what I had found. Someone didn't want me there, didn't want me to know what had happened. But what could I do? If I left, I'd be out of a job and broke. If I stayed, I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me jump, every creak of the old wood setting my nerves on edge. When morning came, I was exhausted, but I kept working. I needed the money, but more than that, I needed to understand. Who were these people? Why were they watching me? The attack started that evening. I had just finished nailing down the last shingle when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but again, there was no one. Then something whizzed past my head. A rock, sharp and fast, thrown with precision. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't stay much longer, but I also knew I couldn't leave without knowing the truth. The next day, I decided to fight back. I set up a trap, using the creaky door as bait. Then I waited. It didn't take long. That night, they came again, pushing the door open slowly. I saw a shadowy figure slip inside, moving carefully, but I was ready. I swung the heavy hammer I had in my hand, connecting with a sickening thud. The figure crumpled, groaning in pain. I rushed forward, pinning them down, and for the first time, I saw their face. It was a man, older, his face twisted with anger and something else: fear. I demanded answers, shaking him, but he just kept repeating, "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have found it." In his pocket, I found more photographs, more evidence of the horrific acts that had taken place in the cabin, and something else: a map with other locations marked. As I looked at the map, a horrible realization settled in. This wasn't just about the cabin. There were other places, other victims. And now I knew too much. I left the cabin that night, dragging myself through the woods, injured but alive. I thought I was safe, that I had escaped. But now, every time I close my eyes, I see those faces, hear those words. I know they're still out there, watching, waiting. And I'm left wondering if I'll ever truly be free.